Hello everyone and welcome to Talk of the Town. I'm James Milan and today I am with Dr. Liza Talusan, and doctor in this case refers to Ph.D. But she was just recently in town last week for a completely frigid night which nonetheless drew 160 plus parents to the Thompson School for a workshop that Dr. Talusan, or Liza, I'm going to call you Liza if that's okay, did, and I'm going to let her explain both what the content and the structure of that event was, and then we're going to dig a little bit deeper. So first of all, thank you very much for being here.
Thanks. And I'll say thanks for the little doctor note there. I actually do come from a family of medical doctors, and at Thanksgiving, it's quite hilarious to see like who's the real doctor. Little insight into my family, James.
Well, believe me, a PhD certainly earns you whatever title you want.
Why, thanks. Please tell my brother and the rest of my family that. So yeah, it was a great honor to be with the Thompson community and the Arlington community. We've actually been planning that event for, I would say, about a month and a half at this point. I was contacted by a member of the Diversity and Inclusion Council, which I'm told that at the school level, they have a number of these different groups happening, which is wonderful to think about how structurally these groups are present in Arlington. And so initially it was just going to be a program just for that one elementary school. Mm-hmm. And of course, right, I think once we got into it, realizing just how important it was to have a conversation district-wide.
Well, we should step back and explain what the conversation was about.
Sure, yes. So we're really exploring what it means to have courageous conversations about race in particular. And it really came up because whether it's our current climate or, you know, just as parents who want to be involved in responsible education for their children, I think folks realized that they just didn't have the tools to have these conversations. And honestly, James, some people were just afraid of having the conversations. The other question that people brought to the table was, I'm not afraid. I think I have some tools. I just don't think I'm doing it right. Mm-hmm. Like, can you tell me that I am or tell me that I'm not? So people came to this session with every different intention possible. And we spent about an hour and a half, almost 2 hours, just really diving deep into what does it mean to have conversations about race, and what does it mean to do it courageously, knowing that they're so hard.
And as you mentioned, it was originally intended to be just the Thompson School group, I guess, which would be elementary school parents. Right. But I assume that with this much larger group, once it was opened up to the wider community, you probably had parents there of children of all ages.
Yes, for sure. Yes.
And did you need to? I mean, I'm just trying to imagine how you make something work on a workshop level. Right. For 160 people. I assume you're dividing them into smaller groups in a lot of ways. Did you use like the age of the parents' children as one way to divide them? Does it make sense for parents of high schoolers to talk to other parents of high schoolers, et cetera?
Sure, right. Great question, and it makes perfect sense when you think about how do I approach this conversation from a developmental perspective. So I believe that there's future conversations that need to happen that are by age group. But my approach, especially when I get to these big workshops, is to say, regardless of the age of your child, I turn it, James, so far inward, and I go, who are you in these conversations? So whether or not you have a 5-year-old or a 15-year-old, what is it about you as a parent, as a 43-year-old in this conversation? And I think that's what makes my workshops really different. I offer content, so here's just some common understanding, common definitions. Here's some protocol for how we can even have courageous conversations tonight. And then what's so different is I then provide a whole bunch of different questions where parents can pair up and have conversations with each other. So to your point, how do you do this with 160 people? With a lot of forgiveness and patience. I usually start off by saying, like, I'm just asking for your patience and flexibility. This is not going to be perfect, and I bet neither is our parenting. So let's just do this. So folks are divided up into groups. They have partners. It just kind of worked out that way. I give them a particular question. So for example, one of the questions I asked them was, in thinking about your own childhood in your own elementary school or middle or high school, how similar or different was your high school or middle school from the one that your child has right now? And then what does that mean? What has been the impact of your school experience and how you kind of behave as a parent? So folks had just some time to go back and forth. And what I know to be true is that people start to think or start to realize that they're not the only ones who have these really tough questions. And I promise you, James, even knowing that information is really freeing, right? It gives them permission to go, oh, well, I don't have this parenting thing all figured out. And then they start to work together. They start to plan together. So one of the biggest outcomes of the night is just building community with other parents who are so interested in the conversation.
Right, and you've already pointed out that one important factor that you home in on right away is, what's the parent's own situation and what was their own experience like, and how is that going to affect their ability to engage with their children around this kind of thing. What are the other kind of main factors that are going to impact how challenging that is? Well, let's accept as a given that it's challenging. No matter where you're coming from, this is not an easy thing to do. But what are the other factors that really, can make this particularly difficult?
Right. I think just the inherent nature of parenting. We don't want to get it wrong. And what we found is when folks don't want to get it wrong, they just choose not to do it. Or they push it on to someone else. Well, they'll learn that in school. I don't have to do it here. And we want to make the connection that, well, we hope they're learning it in school. But James, given my work around the country, not every school is talking about race and our history. And so it often does fall upon parents and caregivers to have the conversation. So that's the first thing. I think they don't want to get it wrong. And that makes perfect sense. The second piece is that for many of us, now I said I'm 43, I grew up in the age of colorblind and that it was impolite to talk about race. So I didn't have role models about how to do it, right? I have my 15-year-old's about to drive. I'm pretty sure I'm going to teach her how to drive the way my dad taught me how to drive. And when you don't have that in a conversation about race, where do you turn to? So I think people just don't even know where to turn to. And then the final thing is we just haven't taken time on our own as adults to think about, well, what are my first messages about race? How do I feel in this conversation? And so then we're not prepared to have conversations with our kids. Those are the biggest ones. I think other ones are that, I think it's the same thing around sex or other topics that we address with our kids, that if we bring it up, then all of a sudden it'll explode. So I do hear from parents, well, if I talk about race, then my kid will notice it. And I'm like, oh, they already noticed. There's just some things about that, right? And we've seen that modeled in other areas of parenting. So I just think there's some myths that we have about the conversation. And so as I work with parents, just really giving them the courage and the tools for how to do this and to know that it's okay to mess up. We're going to, right? That I feel like that's part of the job description of parenting.
Right.
Yeah.
And the factors that you just laid out are universal, as you said. Conversations around, let's say, identity in general can touch on all different aspects of that, but are going to be difficult in a lot of ways for a lot of the same reasons.
That's right.
However, there are clearly some things about race itself that make it a tough or tough topic for us to engage in public conversation around, conversation with strangers who are also of, in our peer group perhaps, at least of the same age, and then of course conversations between generations.
Yes.
What can you tell us from the fact that you have been doing this for a while and studying it for a while, that you have identified or realized about race itself as a topic that makes it particularly naughty, particularly
I love that you said naughty, because I think many of us have grown up
naughty
with that.
That's with K-N-O-T-T-Y.
Oh, I thought a whole different other
and
naughty.
then maybe the other naughty too. You take your pick.
And sometimes we were penalized. So even when I think about some of my earliest times as a parent, right, or when I've been working with other parents, if our child walked by and said, oh, mommy, that woman's Asian, we as parents have shushed them, right? And like, shh, that's impolite. But we would never say that if they said, oh, mommy, there's a red car, or there's this, or there's that. And so we know that children identify, right? And so, but we've given them particular messages about not talking about race. And I think there's this other piece that comes from a very loving place, that we are all equal, right? That everybody has opportunity, and it feels good to talk about that. It is much more difficult to say, well, actually not everybody has the same opportunity. That's really hard. It's also this like popping of the balloon, right, for kids, because it's just a lovely message. And I think we like to stay on that message. So I think that's another reason why it's felt kind of naughty in both definitions. And then, when I think about schools and teachers, having done a lot of teacher training, our teachers, by and large, haven't been taught how to talk about race. And when you think about my own kids are in school for 8 hours a day, right? So it's a long system and chain of ways in which we haven't learned to talk about it. And so what I'm trying to do, James, is to give people tools for how to do it. For those folks who might be more nervous about engaging in the conversation, I think that's a very legitimate piece. I always say, well, then start by reading, right? Like, ask people what are some key texts that are really helpful. Honestly, for me, when I've come across particular issues that I don't feel very comfortable with yet. So for example, for me, I feel like I have a pretty good understanding of the LGBTQ community at large. I don't identify as a member of that community. And recently I've had to really come to understand, what is gender non-binary? What does that mean? And so I've had to turn to books. I have to be honest, as folks are looking for some advice, James, I pick up young adult fiction. Young adult fiction has been really helpful for me, particularly from great writers, because it's not overly academic. It's helped me to really empathize with a character, which has then made me more curious about what are the experiences of real people.
Right.
That's been my pathway. In my workshops, I'm not overly prescriptive about how to do it. For me, that's worked. Finding an issue, looking at some young adult fiction, and then making the connections to the real world.
Yeah, very interesting. I mean, as you were speaking, I'm realizing that, works of imagination, whether it's young adult fiction or a well-done movie, or is, like you said, a way for people to connect and empathize with issues that might be in the abstract just too much for them to grasp.
Right, yes,
And another thing that I was struck by in what you were talking about is the fact that with race, if the conversation is about race, wherever you are on whatever the spectrum is, it's you're being outed in a sense, exposed for where you are on that. And you may think to yourself, oh, well, I'm a white person, I have everything going for me. I should feel worse about my privilege than I do. Or you can start from there, and then you can be anywhere else on the spectrum. But once you start talking about race, you're identifying that there is that spectrum, and that you have a place on it, and that there are implications for that, et cetera.
Yes.
And I think that that's probably pretty daunting for people as well.
Yes. I love that you brought up that aspect of guilt. It's something that comes up quite a bit when I do these workshops. And honestly, James, I've started to ask people to reframe guilt as an invitation. Right? Guilt is a feeling that we have, right? It happens whenever we encounter something that we feel like we didn't deserve, or someone told us we didn't deserve it. And so it's associated with feelings of shame, right, and anxiety. And I always say, well, what would it mean if we saw guilt as an invitation, right? An invitation to figure out why I feel that way, or where it's coming from, or why that person's making me feel guilty in a particular way. So my gosh, what a gift if it's an invitation, right? This like stinky feeling that I have, an invitation to get more curious. I mean, what a great place to start, right? Now it does take some moral character in there, right? Like it takes me to be able to say, I'm feeling guilty, like here's my invitation, now what do I do with it? I think a lot of people stop at the guilt phase. It's like when you work out for the first time on January 2nd, right? For your New Year's resolutions, and you're like, this hurts, like I don't like it. Most people quit, right? We know that people give up on their gym membership 2 weeks in. And I think the same thing happens with difficult conversations. The minute it starts to feel hard, or it's taking up time from something else, we quit. And I'm asking people to keep pushing forward, just like you have in other parts of your life, right? To push through some of that discomfort, which is just a part of the learning process.
Right.
Yeah.
I think often also of guilt for myself as a way of getting out of something. In other words, I won't do anything. I'll just feel guilty about it. So I'm paying my penance in a sense by feeling bad for the fact that I won't do anything, you know, and that gets very, very complicated as an internal conversation, much less an external conversation.
Right. And that's what I loved so much about those parent workshops, when people actually have a chance to connect, because exactly how you described that, James, I think people feel this real internal conflict. When it kind of festers, it starts to feel, you start to pull away and move away from it. And so when you have parents and caregivers come together, adults come together, and they're like, my gosh, you feel that too? So do I. Something external happens, right? And then they can connect and they can have conversation. One of the things that I had participants do at the end of that night was to go through this like 10-step plan, right? Like, what's 1 or 2 steps that you might take before you go to bed tonight? Like, we're not going to solve racism, you know, at 9 o'clock on a frigid night, but what's one thing you can do, right? And by the time they get to step 10, it's, well, then who but you can hold yourself accountable, right? What would it mean for you to move forward? These little tiny steps that we have to take.
Right, something that people can imagine themselves doing and can incrementally add up to real something that's real change or progress, we hope. We don't have a whole lot of time left, and we don't want to take too much of your time, but I wanted to ask you, I know that this is both the field that you practice in, but also part of the world that you live, that you wake up to every day. And that's because your own family is kind of a mixed backgrounds between your husband and yourself, and then you have children. So just speak briefly, if you can, about how it is to wear those different hats throughout the day.
Yeah, I don't know if it's like I do this work because of my family, or my family is a product of the work that I do, but you know, we check off so many boxes, right? Like inter-ethnic, inter-religious family. I have multiracial children who look very different along the spectrum of what we could possibly look like. You know, different identities in terms of, you know, their gender identity, and so there's just lots of things that happen in terms of my own family. I think what's been really helpful, though, is that one of the tools I learned as a facilitator is about these challenging conversations. And so therefore, when I come home, my kids are always like, thanks for the TED Talk, Mom. Right? Like, I don't think they love that I'm working them sometimes, but I mean, we are able to have really challenging conversations, and I'm sure it doesn't surprise you, James, like there's some things that I don't agree with that my kids do and say and behave. And if I'm really committed to being a thoughtful and engaged parent, then I'm part of the learning process with them. It also matters about how we show up in this world. I look very Asian American. My husband looks very Afro-Puerto Rican, Afro-Latino. And so even when we walk through this world, we experience the world very differently. And we have those conversations with each other. And there's so many things, James, that I've missed. Right, like when he and I walk into a grocery store, and he's considerably darker than me, I never get stopped. And there are times where he'll get stopped, you know, by a security guard saying, "Hey, sir, you know, can I help you? Can I help you?" And here we are walking to the same store.
And everybody knows what that means,
right? Yeah, and maybe it's out of, you know, kindness. It's sometimes that's not how he interprets it, right? So yes, in my own family it shows up. I hope people realize that I mess up all the time. My kids know that. They will tell you very quickly that I'm not perfect. And I think that's been an important part of it. So there are many, you asked me about the hats. I think I wear the same hat most of the time. And there are very clear times, James, where I have to take off the facilitator, educator hat just so that I could listen to my children without that lens, right? It's so hard for me, and so important that they can just talk to me as their mother, as opposed to like this diversity educator. And I think it's hard for them to be in my family, right? Because we just have such high expectations about what is socially just. And like with everybody, it's hard.
And what is robust communication? You know, they might just feel like not engaging.
Rest assured, when I say, "How was school?" they are like, "Fine." Like, it's not like just like every other family.
That's right.
Yes.
Well, that gives me an opening actually for the last question I want to ask you today, and I would love to have you back, I have to say, for a more extended conversation at another point. But anyway, whether it was within your family or somewhere else, if you can identify a particularly difficult conversation that you facilitated and what you took away from that, I would love to hear that.
Absolutely, right. It's very difficult for me in workshops when a participant says something, and I believe it is not with malintent, right? They don't know me. Where they say something that personally reflects my family or someone in my family or an identity, and I have to practice what I preach, which is, I do all this thing about like what happens when your buttons get pushed. And I tell people, like, just breathe. We live in such a reactive culture, right? I mean, as I was driving up this morning to Castillo, I was listening to a NPR story about Twitter and just how fast we are to respond. And when I tell people, when your button gets pushed, just breathe. James, the room cracks up. They laugh. And I'm like, isn't this interesting? The fact that like breathing and taking a breath is shocking to all of us. So when I have to deal with difficult conversations, I have to remind myself to breathe, right? And to better understand where is this comment coming from. James, it's like the hardest thing that I have to do. And so I ask folks, or we'll say things like, thank you so much for your comment. What you said does not align with my experience, which is another way of saying like, I'm so mad at you. I don't believe you. I'm angry, right? Like, thank you so much. What you said doesn't align.
Right, and confrontational and adversarial way of communicating.
And it makes it very clear, right? You said something that is not in my lived experience. I have to do that quite a bit. And then I also have to know, James, when enough is enough, right? When it's time to move on. Listen, I do these courageous conversations. I hope that the majority of them end with an intact relationship. And some of them just can't, James. Some of them really, you just have to walk away from. And so I think part of that difficulty is knowing when that happens. And that often comes up with, but Liza, it's my father, or it's my sibling, or it's my spouse, right? Or it's my child who I really disagree with. And I think at that point, you have to set priorities or boundaries around what we're allowed to talk about and what we can talk about. And I think that's part of this really difficult process. But I get triggered all the time. I get mad, I get upset. I'm trained to kind of keep my cool. And I really continue to throw it back to the participant to just say, can you tell me a little bit more about why you're saying that, or why that's important for you to say right now in this moment? And I just think, honestly, James, people just want to be heard, right? Usually when I do ask them that, it's genuine. I'm really curious. And they then tell me, and I go, okay, that actually makes sense why you feel that way. Like, thanks so much. Doesn't align with my experience.
Right.
Thanks for saying it. Right.
Well, thank you for saying all that you have said during our conversation, and for not citing this conversation as the most difficult one that you've had.
This is not difficult.
No, just kidding. But I do very much appreciate your sharing a lot of insight and giving us a lot to think about and contemplate, and to plan for a future conversation around.
Sounds great. Looking up for it.
So thanks again.
Thanks.
For Dr. Liza Talusan, I'm James Milan. This is Talk of the Town. Thanks for joining us.